In the spring of 1892, a county clerk in the mountains of Appalachia opened his ledger, dipped his pen, and drew a single black line through an entire family. Not one name, all of them. The Netherbys of Sorrel Hollow, struck from the record as though they had never drawn a single breath. The census that year counted every soul in the valley, every soul but theirs. The tax rolls skipped their land as if the ridge they lived on did not exist. The church register held no marriages, no baptisms, and no burials under their name. For a family that had lived on Harrow Ridge for 3 generations, the paper trail simply stopped, as though someone had reached back through time and pulled them out by the root. The people of Collier's Cross called it a mercy. They said some things are better left forgotten. They said the valley had finally cleaned itself. But mercy does not explain the burned foundation stones. It does not explain the graves that were dug in a circle, every one of them facing inward. And it certainly does not explain why, more than 100 years later, the maps of that hollow still carry a blank space where a whole settlement used to stand. This is the story of the family the entire valley feared. And the harder you look at what really happened to them, the less the official version holds together. Before we go any further, I want you to do one small thing. Down in the comments, type the name of the town closest to where you grew up, the small one, the one that barely shows up on a map. Because every valley, like Sorrel Hollow, has a family the neighbours learned to look away from, and by the end of this you are going to recognise the pattern in your own bones. So, drop that name below, and let us see how many of these forgotten places you all quietly come from. Now let us go back to the beginning, to the year the Netherbys first came down out of the fog. To understand the family, you first have to understand the ground. Sorrel Hollow sat in a fold of the old mountains, in the part of Appalachia where the ridges run so close together that the sun does not touch the valley floor until nearly midday, and leaves it again by 3 in the afternoon. The people who settled there in the early 1700s were not fools. They were hard, careful, God-fearing folk who knew how to read land. And every one of them, when they first walked into that hollow, felt the same thing, a reluctance, a pull in the gut telling them to keep walking. The soil was good, the water ran clean and cold off the high rock. There was game in the timber and fish in the creek. By every measure a family should have been glad to claim it. And yet the first settlers left more than half of Sorrel Hollow empty for almost 80 years, farming only the low end near the mouth, as if the upper hollow belonged to someone they did not want to meet. They had reasons they did not like to say out loud. The old survey of the region, the one the Crown ordered before the War for Independence, marks the upper hollow with a single strange notation. Where every other parcel carries a name and an acreage, that one carries only 2 words in a cramped and faded hand: older ground, not old growth, which is what a surveyor would write about untouched forest. Older ground, as if the man with the chain and the compass had stood on that rise, looked at whatever was there, and understood that the land had been used long before any European set foot on the continent, and long before the tribes who traded in the lowlands could remember either. Because there were stones up there. That is the part the county histories never printed, though the families who lived nearby all knew it. On the high shoulder of Harrow Ridge, half swallowed by moss and root, there were foundation stones far too large and far too square to be the work of any homesteader. They were cut, dressed on their faces, fitted together without mortar in the way that only appears in places men have been told to marvel at from a safe distance behind a rope, and they were laid out in a shape that made no sense for a cabin or a barn or a church. They formed a ring, a great open ring, easily 200 feet across, with a lower ring inside it, and at the centre a flat slab of stone worn smooth in a way that running water alone does not explain. The settlers did not build those stones. Every honest account agrees on that much. The stones were already there, already ancient, already half-buried, when the first white family walked into the hollow. And the tribes the settlers questioned would not go near the place. They did not call it cursed exactly. The word the old traders wrote down, the closest they could get in their own tongue, was reset. A place that had been wiped clean and started again. A place where the world had once been ended and quietly rebuilt, and where the seam still showed if you knew where to press. So the good families stayed down near the mouth of the hollow. They let the upper ground sit empty. They told their children not to climb past the split oak, and they told each other that empty land is only empty until the wrong sort of people come looking for a place where no one will bother them. For 80 years the ring of stones sat alone in the fog, and the valley went on farming its low fields and pretending the high ground was simply too steep to be worth the trouble. And then, in the autumn of 1840, the wrong sort of people came looking, and they walked straight past the split oak, straight up the forbidden slope, and they built their long house on the ring of ancient stones, as though they had come home to something that had been waiting for them all along. Before we move on to the family the valley feared, stop for a second. What you just heard about Sorrel Hollow and the ground it was built on is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original county survey of the hollow, the circle of graves, the blank space on the map. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. No one in Collier's Cross ever agreed on where the Netherbys came from. That was the first strange thing about them, and in a way it was the thing that never stopped being strange. In those years, a new family did not simply appear. They came with a wagon and a story. They came with a letter of introduction from a preacher 2 counties over, or a cousin who could vouch for them, or at the very least a trade and a Bible and a common way of speaking that told you which valley had raised them. The Netherbys came with none of that. They came up the old Drover Road in the last grey week of October, in a single long wagon drawn by 2 horses that no one recognised as belonging to any farm within a week's ride. And they came in silence. The man who saw them first was a boy at the time, a lowland boy named Tolliver who was mending fence near the mouth of the hollow. He was an old man when he finally told the story to a travelling writer, and he told it the same way every time, which is how you know a man is not lying. He said the wagon came out of the morning fog so quietly that the birds did not stop singing, and that this was the wrong thing, because a loaded wagon on that road made a racket you could hear a mile off. He said he counted the people walking behind it, 9 that he could see. Then he blinked, and there were 11. Then he looked again and could not settle on a number at all, because they moved in and out of the mist in a way that made his eyes slide off them. He said the man at the front lifted one hand to him, not a wave, a gesture like a man laying a claim on a thing he has decided is already his. And then the whole procession turned up the forbidden slope past the split oak, and the boy ran the entire way home without once looking back, and he never in his long life set foot in the upper hollow again. They built fast. That was the second strange thing. A cabin, a real cabin, is the work of a season, maybe 2. Cut and hauled and notched and raised with the help of every neighbour you can beg or bribe. The Netherbys had no neighbours and asked for no help. And by the first hard frost of that first winter there was smoke rising from a long low house on the top of Harrow Ridge, sitting square on the ring of ancient stones. Men who went up to look, and there were a few brave ones in the early years, came back pale and said the same thing. The house did not sit beside the old foundation, it sat on it. The great cut stones of the ancient ring had become the footing of the Netherby home, as though the family had looked at that dressed and ancient rock and seen not a mystery to be feared, but a floor plan to be finished. The father was named Absalom Netherby. He was tall in a way that the lowlanders found hard to describe, because it was not simply height. A tall man is still a man, and you can measure him against a doorframe and be done with it. The trouble with Absalom, the old accounts say, was that he seemed tall from every distance. Close up he did not tower. But a mile off, standing on his ridge against the sky, he looked like a figure that belonged to a larger scale of world, a thing built to different proportions than the people below. His face, the few who dealt with him remembered, was handsome and calm and entirely without warmth, the face of a man who has never once in his life been afraid, and who finds the fear of others neither cruel nor amusing but simply useful. He came down into Collier's Cross exactly 4 times a year, always at the turning of the season, always alone, on foot, carrying a leather satchel. And he always came to trade, which is the detail that kept the valley from driving him off in those early years, because a man who trades fair is a man the mountains will tolerate no matter how strange his blood. And Absalom Netherby traded better than fair. He brought down furs that were richer and thicker than any the local trappers could take, cured in a way no one could match. He brought down carved things, small figures and boxes and handles worked from black wood and pale bone, so finely made that the merchant at the crossroads store kept the best of them under his counter and only showed them to buyers he trusted. And he brought down silver, raw silver, in rough lumps, more of it every year, from a valley where no one had ever found a trace of silver ore in 200 years of digging. Where a lowland family would have grown rich and proud on such trade, the Netherbys grew only quieter and only larger. That was the third strange thing, and it was the one that finally turned the valley's unease into something closer to dread. The family grew, fast, faster than births alone could account for. In the first spring after they arrived there were the 9 or 11 that the boy had counted. Within 5 years the men who dared the upper trails spoke of dozens. Within 10 years the number had become a thing people were afraid to guess at, because to guess at it was to admit you had been up there counting, and no one wanted to admit that. Children were seen, old ones were seen, but no one ever saw a Netherby woman heavy with child come down to the midwife, and no one ever saw a Netherby coffin carried out. The family only ever seemed to gather, never to scatter, never to end. To the people of Collier's Cross, the strangeness of the Netherbys might have stayed a matter of gossip forever, the kind of thing you tell a traveller over a fire and half hope he does not believe, if the family had only kept to their ridge. Strange neighbours are an old story in the mountains. Every valley has one hollow it will not enter after dark, one family whose land the hunting dogs refuse to cross. Fear, by itself, does not make a legend. What makes a legend is when the fear turns out to be justified. And with the Netherbys, the justification came slowly, the way rot comes to good timber, one soft place at a time until you push your thumb through the whole beam. It began with the animals. In the 3rd year after the family settled the ridge, the livestock of the upper farms started to go wrong, not stolen. Stolen would have been a comfort, because stolen has a thief you can hang. These animals were found. A milk cow standing in her field at dawn, unhurt, unmarked, but dead on her feet with her eyes rolled white, and every drop of milk in her gone dry in a single night. A flock of good-laying hens gone silent and still on their roost, not one of them touched by fox or weasel, simply emptied of whatever it is that makes a hen a living thing rather than a shape. A prize hog found at the edge of the tree line, facing the ridge, kneeling. Farmers do not use that word lightly. A hog does not kneel, but that is the word 3 separate men used, and none of them would say another word about it after, because a kneeling hog is a thing your mind refuses to keep, and they were grateful to be allowed to forget it. The families of the upper hollow began to move down toward the mouth, quietly. They told each other it was for the schooling, or for the church, or because the low fields were warmer in the frost. They did not tell each other the truth, which was that they had started to feel watched in their own homes, and that the watching seemed to come from up the slope, from that long low house sitting on its ring of old stone. One by one the upper cabins went dark and empty, and the forest took them, and the only light left burning above the split oak was the Netherby light, and it never went out. People said you could see it from the crossroads on a clear night, a single steady point high on the black ridge, and that if you watched it too long it seemed to grow, as though it were coming down the mountain toward you, though in the morning it was always right where it had always been. Then the children began to go. Not many. That was the terrible cleverness of it, if cleverness is the word, and no one who studied the pattern later could decide whether it was clever or simply the way a slow tide takes sand, a grain at a time so that you never see it move. 1 child in a year. Sometimes not even 1. A child would wander too far up a berry slope in the late summer and simply not come home. A search would go out, torches and dogs and grim quiet men, and it would climb as high as the split oak, and there it would stop, because the dogs would not go past the oak. They would sit down in the trail, every one of them, and shake and whine and turn their faces away from the ridge, and no whipping and no coaxing on this earth would move them up that slope. And the men, looking at their own dogs refusing the trail, would find that their own legs had grown just as unwilling, and they would tell themselves that the child had surely fallen in the creek or been taken by a cat, and they would go home and they would grieve, and they would never, ever say the name that every one of them was thinking. Because everyone knew. That is the thing the county histories cannot bring themselves to put down plainly, and the thing the old people would only tell you with the lamp turned up and the door barred. Everyone in the valley knew the children were going up the ridge, and not one of them could make himself go up after them. It was not cowardice. These were men who had faced bear and flood and the long murdering winters of the high country. It was something the mind does when it meets a thing it was not built to face. The will simply pours out of you, the way water pours out of a cracked jug, and you stand there empty and ashamed, and you turn around and you go back down. Absalom Netherby had built his house on a place the old maps called older ground, on a ring of stones that a lost people had raised to mark where the world was once ended and begun again. And whatever that ground was, whatever seam ran through it, the family up there had learned to draw the fear of the whole valley up the slope and into themselves, and to feed on it and to grow. There was one man in Collier's Cross who refused to turn his face away, and his name has come down to us more clearly than almost any other in this story, because he wrote things down, and because what he wrote survived. Reverend Elias Crome came to the valley in the winter of 1871, a young preacher sent up from the flatlands to a mountain congregation that had gone nearly 30 years without a settled minister. He was earnest and stubborn, and he had the particular kind of courage that belongs to men who have never yet been truly afraid, and who therefore do not know how much it costs. He heard the stories about the ridge within his first month, and he did what a young and stubborn preacher does. He decided that the fear itself was the sin, that the valley had made an idol out of its own dread, and that the cure was to walk up that mountain in daylight with a Bible in his hand and shake the hand of Absalom Netherby like a Christian, and prove there was nothing up there but a strange, proud family who needed the gospel like anyone else. He went up in the spring of 1872. He went alone, against the pleading of every elder in his church, and he came back down 3 days later, and the man who came down was not the man who had gone up. His hair, they said, had gone from brown to the colour of ash at the temples, though he was not yet 30. He would not say what he had seen. For years he would not say. He preached, he married the young and buried the old. He baptized the babies of the valley in the cold creek water, and he did all of it with the manner of a man who has looked over the edge of something and spends every waking hour trying not to look again. He forbade his congregation to go up the ridge for any reason. He preached against curiosity as though it were the worst of the deadly sins. And every year, on the anniversary of the day he came down, he shut himself in the little parsonage and did not come out, and those who passed on the road at night said they could hear him praying in a voice that did not sound like praying. That sounded like a man arguing with something that would not agree. We know what Reverend Crome saw on the ridge, or at least we know what he claimed, because near the end of his life he wrote it down. He was an old man by then, sick and thin and past caring what the valley thought of him, and he set it all in a long letter that he sealed and left with the one grandson he trusted, with instructions that it not be opened until every Netherby was gone from the earth. That grandson kept the letter for 40 years. It is the closest thing this story has to a witness, and every strange claim in it lines up with the older accounts in a way that a lie would not. So it is worth telling plainly what the Reverend wrote, in the order that he wrote it, because it is the spine of everything that came after. He wrote that Absalom Netherby met him at the tree line, though the Reverend had told no one he was coming, and that Absalom greeted him by name, and by the name of the town he had been born in 200 miles away, a thing no living soul in the valley knew. He wrote that the long house was far larger inside than it could possibly be from without, that he walked its length for what felt like the better part of an hour and never reached a back wall, and that the floor beneath the plank boards was not earth but the old dressed stone, cold as deep water and faintly, steadily warm to the touch at the same time, which he knew was impossible and which he felt with his own hand. He wrote that there were many, many Netherbys, more than a house that size in any honest world could hold, and that they did not speak to him, and that they watched him pass with a patience that was worse than hunger, the way you might watch a fly walk across a table you intend to clear later. And he wrote about the centre of the house, where the ring of old stone came to its heart, where that smooth central slab lay under a hole cut in the roof, so that the sky looked straight down onto it. He wrote that around the slab the family had set the small carved figures, the black wood and pale bone ones that Absalom sold at the crossroads store, hundreds of them, in patterns that hurt to follow with the eye. And he wrote the sentence that the valley would repeat in whispers for 100 years, the sentence his grandson could never bring himself to read aloud. He wrote that the slab was not empty, That something rested upon it that was neither living nor dead nor stone nor flesh, that it had the shape of a sleeping man and the size of a fallen tree, and that when the light from the open roof moved across it, it breathed, slow, deep. Once, while the Reverend stood frozen at the edge of the ring, it breathed, and Absalom Netherby, standing beside him, had leaned close and said, in a voice like a door settling in an old house, that his family did not worship the thing on the slab. They kept it. They fed it. And when it woke, as it had woken before, when the ground was younger, it would set the world back to the beginning. And the Netherbys, who had tended it faithfully through the long sleep, would be the only family left to walk the clean and empty earth on the far side of the reset. For 20 years after the Reverend came down the mountain, the valley lived inside an arrangement no one had ever agreed to out loud. It was a truce of a kind. The Netherbys took what the ridge took, a little every year, quiet and slow, and in exchange they left the low fields alone, and they came down 4 times a season to trade fair, and they never once raised a hand against a soul in daylight in the sight of witnesses. And the people of Collier's Cross paid that price the way a village pays a price it cannot bear to name. They stopped letting their children pick berries on the high slopes. They stopped sending their young men to hunt the upper timber, no matter how thin the winter larder. They built their lives in the shape of the fear, the way a tree grows around a fence wire driven into it when it was young, until the wire is deep inside the wood and the tree cannot remember a time before the wound. A whole generation grew up in that valley knowing, without being told, that the world had a lid on it, and that the lid was up the ridge, and that you did not lift it. But a truce that feeds on children is not a truce. It is only a delay, and the delay ran out in the hard winter of 1891, the winter that finally broke the valley's patience and set in motion everything the clerk would later try to erase with a single line of ink. Her name was Naomi Fenn. She was 7 years old, the youngest daughter of the county clerk himself, a serious and careful man named Josiah Fenn, who kept the records of the valley in a locked cabinet and believed, as careful men do, that a thing written down is a thing made safe. Naomi was the light of that house. She had been born late, when her mother had given up hope of another child, and she had come into a family of grave older brothers like a spark into a cold hearth. On a grey afternoon in the middle of December, with the first real snow coming on, she went out to the woodpile at the edge of the Fenn property to fetch kindling for the evening fire, a chore she had done 100 times, a chore that took no child past the safe low ground near the town. Her mother watched her go from the kitchen window. She turned to lift a pot. When she turned back, the yard was empty. The basket was lying on its side in the fresh snow, and there was a single line of small footprints leading away from the woodpile, up the slope, toward the ridge, in a straight and unwavering line, as though the child had known exactly where she was going and had gone gladly. There were no other tracks beside hers. That was the detail that broke Josiah Fenn. Not a man's boot, not the pad of an animal, not the drag of a body pulled against its will. Only the small bare prints of his daughter's own feet, walking herself up the mountain in the falling snow, toward the one place in the world he had spent her whole short life keeping her away from. The snow was filling the tracks even as he knelt over them. He followed them up the slope in the last grey light, calling her name until his voice tore, and the tracks led him exactly as far as the split oak, and there, in the deepening dark, they stopped, not because the snow had covered them. He could see the clean, unbroken white beyond the oak, no prints of any kind, as though the child had reached that ancient boundary stone and simply been lifted off the face of the earth. Above him, high on the black ridge, the Netherby light burned steady and did not so much as flicker. And Josiah Fenn, careful man, keeper of records, did what every father before him had done at that oak for 50 years. He felt the will pour out of him like water from a cracked jug, and he turned around, and he went back down the mountain without his daughter, and he sat in his cold kitchen all that night, and did not weep and did not speak. And by the time the sun came up, something in him had changed from a grieving man into something harder and quieter and far more dangerous, because Josiah Fenn did not accept it. That was the thing no father before him had managed. Every man who had lost a child to the ridge had folded the loss into the great valley silence and let it be swallowed. Josiah refused. He went from cabin to cabin in the weeks after, in the deep of that winter, and he sat at other men's tables, and he made them say it, he made them count. He took out a fresh page of his ledger, the same careful hand he used for taxes and deeds, and he wrote down the names. Every child the valley had lost to the upper hollow since the Netherbys came, every kneeling animal, every dark and empty cabin the family's fear had driven down the slope. He laid the pattern out in ink, plain and undeniable, and he carried that page from house to house, and he watched grown men's faces as they read their own dead children's names in his neat clerk's script, names they had spent years teaching themselves not to think. And one by one, in the worst winter anyone could remember, the men of Sorrel Hollow stopped turning their faces away. What Josiah Fenn built that winter was not a mob. A mob is a hot thing, and it burns out fast, and the men of the valley had tried the hot way once, years before, in the early days when a father maddened by loss had run up the slope alone with a torch and a rifle and had never come down, and had been found in the spring sitting against the split oak with his rifle across his knees, unmarked, staring up at the ridge with a smile on his frozen face that no one who saw it ever managed to describe without stopping halfway. No, what Fenn built was cold. It was slow. It was a conspiracy of grieving men who met in the back of the Crossroads store after the lamps went out, and who spoke in low voices, and who understood that whatever lived up that mountain could not be beaten by courage, because courage was the very thing it drank. It had to be beaten by patience, and by numbers, and by choosing the one night in the whole turning year when the family would be least able to draw the fear up the slope and use it. They went to the only man who had been inside the longhouse and come back. Reverend Elias Crome was very old by then, and very sick, and he had not left his parsonage in 3 years. When the men filed into his small dark room and told him what they meant to do, the old preacher wept, which frightened them more than anything, because they had never seen him show weakness. He told them they were fools. He told them the thing on the slab could not be killed, that it was older than killing, that it had ended the world before and would end it again whether they climbed the ridge or not. But then he wiped his face, and he was quiet for a long while, and at last he said something that changed the whole shape of their plan. He told them that they were right about one thing. The thing on the slab could not be killed, but the family could. The Netherbys were the keepers. They fed the sleeper, and they tended it, and they held back the day of its waking, not out of mercy for the world, but because they meant to be its only survivors, and they were not ready. The reset was not due. If the keepers were destroyed before their work was finished, the old preacher believed, the sleeper would have no hand to feed it and no voice to wake it at the proper hour, and it would sink back down into the older ground, and the seam would close, perhaps for another 1,000 years, perhaps forever. Kill the family, he said, and you do not kill the thing, but you rob it of the only door it has into our world. He gave them one more thing. He told them the day. In all his years of dread, the Reverend had worked out the single fact that mattered, the thing Absalom had let slip in that awful hour inside the house. The family's power over the valley, its ability to draw fear up the slope and turn a grown man's legs to water at the split oak, was not the same on every night of the year. It rose and fell with the turning of the seasons, the way a tide rises and falls, and it was at its very lowest on the longest night, the winter solstice, the dead middle of the dark. On that one night, the Reverend said, the family would be turned inward, gathered around the slab, spending everything they had on the long ritual that held the sleeper in its place through the year's deepest dark. On that night, and that night only, the ridge would not be watching the valley, it would be watching itself. And a careful, cold, silent company of men, coming up the slope not in rage but in grief, might get past the split oak before the family ever felt them come. They had 1 year to prepare, because the solstice of that same winter was already too near, and Fenn would not let a single father go up the ridge unready and feed the thing another death. So they waited. Through the spring and the summer and the long gold autumn of 1892 they made ready in secret, and the Netherbys came down 4 times to trade as they always had, and Absalom Netherby looked at the men of Collier's Cross across the counter of the Crossroads store with his calm and handsome and warmthless face, and if he knew what was building in the low valley he gave no sign of it, and the not knowing whether he knew was its own kind of torture. They gathered lamp oil and dry pine and pitch. They cast lead. They swore an oath, each man to every other. that whatever happened on the ridge, no man would speak of it after, no man would write of it, and no man would let his courage fail at the oak, because the one who failed would doom them all. And they marked on Fenn's private calendar, in the careful ink he used for everything that mattered, the night they meant to end it, the 21st of December, 1892, the longest night of the year. The longest night came in with a cold so deep it cracked the trees. Later, the few men who lived to be old and finally broke their oath would all remember that first, before anything else. The cold. It was a stillness that felt aimed, a silence that seemed to lean down over the whole valley and press its ear against the ground. There was no wind. The snow lay hard and blue under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to cut your hand on. And a little before midnight, in ones and twos, out of the dark cabins of Sorrel Hollow, 41 men gathered at the foot of the ridge below the split oak, each with an unlit torch and a grim heart, and not one of them spoke a word, because Fenn had forbidden it, and because there was nothing left in any of them that wanted to be said. Josiah Fenn stood at the front. In the year of preparing he had become the still centre of the whole terrible thing, and the men followed him now the way you follow a man who has already died inside, and therefore cannot be frightened by dying again. He looked up the slope at the Netherby light, and for the first time in living memory the light was not steady, it was pulsing, slow and deep and red, brightening and dimming in a rhythm that the men felt in their chests before they understood it with their minds, and every one of them knew, without being told, that they were looking at the heartbeat of the thing on the slab, and that the family was gathered around it now, spending everything they had, exactly as the old reverend had promised. The ridge was turned inward, and Josiah Fenn stepped past the split oak. He did not feel his legs turn to water. That was the moment the men would speak of in wonder ever after, the moment they knew the old preacher had told them true. For 50 years no man had gone past that oak with his will intact. Fenn went past it and felt only the cold and his own grief and the crunch of hard snow under his boot, and he turned and looked back at the 40 men still standing, frozen at the boundary, and he did not speak, because he could not, but he lifted one hand, the way Absalom Netherby had lifted his hand to a boy at a fence line 52 years before, a gesture like a man laying claim to a thing he has decided is already his. And the men of Sorrel Hollow came up over the split oak and onto the older ground, and the ridge did not stop them, because the ridge, for the first time in 100 years or 1,000, was looking the other way. What happened in the long house on the top of Harrow Ridge on the longest night of 1892 was never written down by any man who was there, and the oath they swore held for the rest of their lives, so that everything we have comes second-hand, from deathbed confessions, and from the one letter the Reverend left, and from the physical evidence the mountain kept. But the pieces that survive agree on a shape, and the shape is this. The men came up out of the dark, and they found the long house exactly as Crome had described it, sitting square on the ancient ring, its single great room open to the freezing stars through the hole in the roof, and the whole enormous family of the Netherbys gathered in their hundreds around the central slab with their backs to the door, robed and swaying and giving voice to a low sound that was not singing and was not words, but that the men could feel loosening the joints of their own skulls. And on the slab, under the open sky, in the pulsing red light, the sleeper lay and slowly breathed, and Absalom Netherby stood over it with his arms raised, and none of them, not one, had turned to face the door, because on the longest night the family did not fear the valley. The valley had never once dared to come. They came now. Grief does what courage cannot, because grief has already lost the thing that fear protects, and a man with nothing left to lose is the one creature in all the world that the ridge could not drink. The men of Sorrel Hollow poured the lamp oil and the pitch along the old dry timber of the long house, and they set their torches to it, and the fire took hold with a roar that finally, at long last, made the family turn around. And what the men saw in the faces of the Netherbys in the light of that spreading fire, the confessions all agree, was the one thing none of them had ever expected to see on that ridge, the one thing that let them do what they did without their hearts giving out. They saw fear. For the first time in 100 years, the family that had fed on the terror of a whole valley stood in the burning house, a new terror of their own, and in their faces the men of Collier's Cross saw at last, plainly and undeniably, that whatever the Netherbys had become, They had once been people, and had traded that away, grain by grain, for a promise of surviving the end of the world. And the men did not stop. They had children in the older ground. They did not stop. The long house burned all night on the top of the ridge, and the men of the valley stood their ground in the terrible heat, and made certain that nothing came out of it. That is as much as any of them would ever say, and it is enough. But the confessions keep one more image from that night, and it is the image that ties the whole story back to the older ground and forward to everything that came after, and it is the reason a company of hard mountain men swore an oath of silence that most of them kept to the grave. They said that as the roof fell in, the pulsing red light did not die with the family. They said the fire reached the centre of the house, the ring within the ring, the smooth central slab, and the thing that lay breathing upon it, and that the flame did not consume the sleeper the way flame consumes a fallen tree. They said the fire went into it, poured into it, as though the thing were drinking the burning of its own keepers the way it had drunk everything else, and that for one long moment it swelled with a light so bright the men on the ridge threw their arms across their faces and saw the bones of their own hands through their own flesh. And they said that in that moment they felt the whole mountain gather itself beneath them, felt the older ground draw a breath the way the thing on the slab drew breath, and that every man there understood in the marrow of him that the reset was very close, that the burning had nearly become the very waking the family had prayed for, that in trying to rob the sleeper of its keepers they had come within a hair's breadth of handing it the end of the world on a plate. And then the last Netherby died in the fire. The keepers were gone. There was no hand left to feed it, and no voice left to wake it at the proper hour, and the old reverend was proved right in the only way that ever mattered. The great light guttered, the mountain let its breath out slow, and the thing on the slab, robbed of its keepers with its work unfinished, sank. That is the word every confession uses. It sank. Down through the smooth stone that was not stone, down into the older ground, down into the seam that the fire had very nearly torn wide open, and that now, with no keeper to hold it, drew slowly and finally closed. The red light went out. The men stood on the ridge in the sudden black of the longest night, with the fire dying at their feet, and above them the winter stars wheeled on exactly as they had before, indifferent, and the world did not end. And Josiah Fenn knelt down in the melting snow at the edge of the ruined ring, and at last, a full year after his daughter walked herself up the mountain in the falling dark, he wept. They came down at first light. 41 had gone up. The confessions disagree, gently and terribly, on how many came down, and it is the one point on which the survivors could never make their stories line up, and perhaps that is the truest thing in the whole account, because a night like that does not leave a man able to count. They came down over the split oak into the low valley in the grey dawn, black with soot and hollow-eyed and older than they had been the night before, and they went to their homes, and they washed, and they buried what needed burying in ground the preacher blessed, and they never spoke of it again. The Netherbys of Sorrel Hollow were gone. The ridge that had held a lid on the whole valley for 2 generations stood empty and burned and quiet under the winter sun, and for the first time in the memory of anyone living, the upper hollow was only a hollow, and the split oak was only a tree, and a child could have walked past it into the high timber and come home again by supper, though it would be a very long time before any parent in that valley could bring themselves to test it. And that should be the end. A hard story with a hard ending, the kind the mountains are full of, the kind you tell by a fire, and half hope the traveller does not believe. A vile family, a fearful valley, and a night of grim justice that freed the low ground from a shadow it had carried too long. If the story ended there, it would only be a legend, and legends do not keep me up at night. But the story does not end there, because 3 months later, in the spring of 1892, that same Josiah Fenn, county clerk, keeper of records, the man who had carried the names of the dead from cabin to cabin in his careful hand, sat down at his cabinet and did a thing that makes no sense for a grieving father who had just won his terrible victory. He opened his ledger, and he found the Netherby name where it had stood for 3 generations, and he drew a single black line through the whole of it, and then he went further than any grieving man would ever go. He set out, deliberately and methodically, to erase the family from the record of the world, as though they had never existed at all. And the question that has haunted this valley for 100 years, The question the official version cannot answer is simple. Why would the man who finally defeated them spend the rest of his life making sure no one would ever know they had been real? The erasure was not the work of a single afternoon. That is what makes it so hard to explain away, and so easy for the county histories to leave out entirely. A grieving man might strike a name from a page in a single moment of rage or sorrow. That would be human. What Josiah Fenn did over the last 11 years of his life was patient and total, and it had the same cold thoroughness as the plan he had built to climb the ridge. He did not simply delete the Netherbys, he unmade them. He went back through the tax rolls of 40 years and he removed every entry that touched their land, redrawing the boundaries of the upper hollow, so that the parcel the long house had stood on simply vanished into the 2 farms on either side, leaving no gap, no seam, no ownerless ground that a curious clerk in some future year might ask a question about. He went to the church register, which he had no right to touch, and somehow the pages that should have carried the trades and the dealings and the deaths were gone, cut out so cleanly that the book falls open naturally to the places where they should have been. He rode 2 counties over to the regional land office, where a copy of the old Crown survey was kept, the one with the words "older ground" written in that cramped and faded hand, and when he came home the master copy of that survey had a blank rectangle scraped into the parchment exactly where the upper hollow used to be described. He was seen doing some of it. That is the strangest part. He did not hide. A younger clerk who worked under him in those last years, and who lived long enough to be interviewed by a folklorist in the 1930s, remembered watching Josiah Fenn burn a whole drawer of deeds in the stove behind the courthouse, feeding them in one at a time, and remembered asking him what he was doing, and remembered the answer, which he repeated word for word to the folklorist 60 years later, because he had never once managed to forget it. Fenn had not looked up from the fire. He had said that a name is a door. He had said that as long as a thing is remembered, it is not truly gone, that memory is the last thin thread that lets a buried thing find its way back up into the world, and that he did not intend to leave the Netherbys even that. He meant to close the door all the way. He meant to make it so that no one would ever again say their name in that valley, because he had learned, up on the ridge, in the light of the burning house, that the thing on the slab did not need the family to survive. It only needed to be remembered, and the family, he had come to believe, had never been the true keepers at all. The valley had, the whole valley, in its long habit of dread, in its 50 years of not saying the name out loud while never once being able to forget it, had been feeding the sleeper all along. This is the point where the story stops being a mountain legend and starts being something that should frighten anyone who has ever wondered why the official history of the world has so many blank spaces in it. Because Sorrel Hollow is not the only place where the ground was called older, and the Netherbys are not the only family that vanished from the record all at once, cleanly, deliberately, in a single stroke, leaving a gap that the maps still carry. If you go looking, and I have, you will find that the pattern repeats across the whole of the mountains and far beyond them. A settlement that shows up on a survey from one decade and is simply gone from the next, no fire recorded, no flood, no plague, just a name lifted off the paper and a blank left where it stood. A family everyone in a county remembers being afraid of, whose graves you can still find in a circle facing inward, and whose name no living person can quite recall, though they will all tell you it is on the tip of their tongue. A ring of dressed and ancient stone, far too large and far too old to be the work of any homesteader, sitting in a hollow that the tribes called Reset, with a farmhouse built square on top of it, as though someone had needed to hold the ground down. The people who study the deep and hidden history of this continent have a name for what happened at Sorrel Hollow, though they use it for the whole vast pattern and not for one burned ridge. They call it the Reset, not the reset the Netherbys prayed for, the ending and remaking of the world, but the quieter, human reset that follows it, the deliberate scrubbing of the record, the redrawn maps and the burned deeds, and the blank rectangles scraped into old parchment, the great forgetting that some hand always seems to arrange in the years after the ground has been disturbed. Someone, they will tell you, has spent a very long time making sure that we do not remember what our own land is built on. Someone has been going through the ledgers of the world with a careful clerk's hand, drawing single black lines through whole families, whole towns, whole ages, closing the doors that memory keeps open. And the terrible possibility that Sorrel Hollow raises, the one that the burning of the Netherbys does not answer but only deepens, is that the men doing the erasing are not the villains of the story. They are the grieving fathers. They are the Josiah Fens. They are the ones who climbed the ridge, who saw the thing on the slab breathe, who felt the older ground draw its breath beneath them, and who came down understanding that the only weapon that has ever worked against it is forgetting. Go looking for Sorrel Hollow today, and you will run straight into the last of Josiah Fen's work, and you will feel the cold of it even now, more than 130 years after he fed the last deed into the courthouse stove. The hollow is still there. The ridges still run close. The sun still leaves the valley floor by mid-afternoon. The creek still runs cold and clean off the high rock. But the name is gone. Pull the modern survey maps of that stretch of the mountains, the ones drawn by the government men with their careful instruments in the middle of the last century, and you will find every hollow around it named and numbered and accounted for. Every one but this one. Where Sorrel Hollow should be, there is a blank. Not a gap in the paper, not a place where the map is torn or faded. The mapmakers simply left it unnamed, an empty fold in the mountains bounded on every side by named land, as though the surveyor who walked that ground had felt the old reluctance that the first settlers felt, had stood at the mouth of the hollow and looked up the slope toward the burned ridge, and had decided, without ever quite letting himself know he was deciding, to leave that particular fold of the world off the record. The door stays closed because every hand that touches it closes it again. The ring of stone is still up there. That much can be confirmed, because a small number of people over the years have gone up to look, and a few of them have come back and talked, and their accounts line up with everything that came before in the way that lies do not. On the top of Harrow Ridge, in a clearing that the forest has never fully reclaimed in all this time, there is a ring of dressed and ancient stone, easily 200 feet across, with a lower ring inside it, and among the stones the black char of a great fire that no rain in a century and a third has entirely washed away. The trees stop at the edge of the ring. Nothing grows on the older ground. And at the centre, where the confessions all place the slab, there is not a slab at all, but a depression, a smooth round sinking in the earth, as though something very large and very heavy that once lay there has since gone down, and the ground has closed over the place where it went the way water closes over a stone. People who stand at the edge of that depression report the same thing, every one of them, and they report it with the sheepish embarrassment of practical people describing something they cannot make fit. They say the ground is faintly, steadily warm. In the dead of winter, with snow on every other surface, the smooth sunk centre of the Netherby ring lies bare and dark, and just slightly warm to the touch, and if you put your hand flat against it and hold very still, some of them say, and only the ones who never go back, you can feel, very slow and very deep and a very long way down, something breathe. The letter was opened at last, in the 1930s. Reverend Crome's grandson, an old man by then himself, having outlived every Netherby by his own reckoning and kept his grandfather's terrible instruction for 40 years, finally broke the seal and read what the young preacher had written after his 3 days on the ridge. And it was he who gave the letter to the folklorist who first tried to gather this whole story into one account before the last witnesses died. Everything in the letter that could be checked against the older record proved true, down to details the grandson could not possibly have known and could not have invented, which is the reason careful people who look into this stop laughing part way through. But the letter also carried a warning in its last lines, a warning the young reverend had set down in 1872, and that reads very differently now that we know how the story ended. He wrote that the thing on the slab could be starved of its keepers and driven back down into the older ground, and that the seam could be closed, and that the world could be spared. But he wrote that it could never be ended, because it did not belong to our order of things, and that a closed door is not a sealed one. He wrote that as long as the ground was remembered, the way back would remain, and that the only true defence was the one no honest man wants to hear. Forget it. Forget the family, forget the ridge, forget the ring of stone, and the warmth in the ground, and the name of the hollow itself. Let the door close all the way. And then, the old preacher wrote in the very last line of the letter, pray that no one ever again decides they have a right to know what has been so carefully forgotten, and goes up the mountain and puts their hand flat against the warm ground at the centre of the ring, and remembers. As for the men who climbed the ridge, the valley kept a quiet count of them for the rest of their lives, though no one ever wrote the count down, because the oath forbade it. They were marked men, and everyone in Collier's Cross knew it, and everyone let them be. They did not prosper, and they did not fall. They lived, most of them, to be old, and they farmed their low fields, and they raised the children they had left, and they carried something behind their eyes that their own families learned not to ask about. On the longest night of every year, it was said, not one of the 40 could sleep. They would sit up in their cabins with the lamp turned high and the door barred, alone or sometimes 2 or 3 together in silence, and they would wait out the dark, and in the morning they would go about their work and say nothing. Whatever they had seen on the ridge, whatever the older ground had shown them in the light of the burning house, it came back for them once a year, on the night the seam ran thinnest, and they met it awake because they could not bear to meet it asleep. One of them broke the oath at the very end, and only barely, and only to a priest. He was the last of the 40 left alive, a very old man in the 1920s, and he sent for a young minister as he was dying, not the valley's own, but a stranger from the flatlands who would not know the names, and he told him a fragment of it, enough and no more. He did not describe the house or the family or the thing on the slab. He said only that he had gone up a mountain once, on the longest night, as a young man, to do a hard and necessary thing, and that he had done it, and that he did not regret it, and that he wanted the young minister to understand one truth before he passed, so that someone in the world would carry it. He said that fear is not the worst thing a valley can feel. He said the worst thing is the calm that comes after, when the danger is gone and the ground is quiet, and everyone agrees, with great relief, never to speak of it again, because that calm is the exact texture of forgetting, and forgetting is the soil the whole thing grows back in. Stay a little afraid, the old man told the young minister. Stay a little afraid of the quiet ground all your life, and teach your children too, because the families who stop being afraid are the ones who ended up building their houses on the ring. Then he died, and the young minister wrote it down, and that fragment is the only words from any of the 40 that come to us in the first person, and it is enough. Josiah Fenn outlived his terrible work by only a little. He finished the erasure, closed the last door, burned the last deed, scraped the last name off the last map his long arm could reach, and then, in the winter of 1903, on the longest night of that year, the county clerk of a valley that no longer appeared on any map sat down at the cabinet where he had kept the records of the world, and he died. He was found the next morning by the younger clerk, sitting upright in his chair, his ledger open before him, his pen in his hand. There was no mark on him. His face, the younger clerk said, and would only say once, wore an expression that was almost peace, the look of a man who has finished a long labour and set down a weight he has carried past all bearing. And on the open page of the ledger, in the careful hand he had used all his life for taxes and deeds and the names of dead children, Josiah Fenn had written a single line, the last thing he ever wrote, and it was not the name of the family he had spent 11 years unmaking. It was the name of his daughter, Naomi Fenn, written once, plainly, in the middle of a blank page, in a book from which he had erased everything else. As though at the very end, having closed every door in the world, the grieving father had opened one small window, just wide enough for one small remembered name, and had gone through it himself to wherever she had gone, up the mountain, in the falling snow, gladly. Now, I have told you this the way it was told to me, the way it comes down through the letter and the confessions and the interviews the folklorists gathered before the last of the witnesses died, and I want to be honest with you about what that means, because you deserve better than a story that only asks you to believe. There is no line in any government record that proves a family named Netherby ever lived on Harrow Ridge, and that is precisely what you would expect to find, whether the erasure really happened, or whether the whole tale is a mountain invention grown fat on 100 winters of retelling. That is the trap of a story like this one. The absence of evidence is exactly what the story predicts. A man could build a lie that no research could ever disprove, simply by claiming, at the centre of it, that all the evidence was deliberately destroyed. A careful mind should hold that possibility firmly, and I do, and I am asking you to hold it too, because a fear that cannot survive an honest look is not worth carrying up the mountain. And yet, the ring of stone is real. You can stand in it. The char of a great fire is real, and old, far older than any modern hoax. The blank on the survey map is real, an unnamed fold of mountain bounded on every side by named land, and no one has ever given a satisfying account of why the government men left it off. The letter is real, and it names details that its keeper could not have known. The warmth in the ground at the centre of the ring has been felt by practical people who went up as skeptics and came down changed and would not go a second time. None of that proves a sleeping thing beneath the older ground, waiting for the world to be remembered back into its reach. But all of it, taken together, is a great deal of smoke for a fire that the official history insists was never lit. And when the official history insists a little too hard, when it goes to the trouble of leaving a whole hollow off the map, a careful mind is allowed to wonder whether the erasing is not the end of the story but the most important part of it. There is one loose thread in all of this that Josiah Fenn could not reach, and it may be the most unsettling part of the whole account, because it is still out there, and some of it may be in a drawer or on a mantle, not far from where you are sitting right now. Fenn could burn the deeds and scrape the maps and cut the pages from the church book. He could unmake a family on paper with a clerk's patience. But there was one kind of Netherby thing he could never gather back, and that was the things the family had sold. For 50 years Absalom Netherby had come down to the Crossroads store 4 times a season carrying that leather satchel, and out of it had come the furs and the raw silver and, most of all, the carved figures, the small worked pieces of black wood and pale bone that the merchant kept under his counter and sold to the buyers he trusted most. Over half a century, that is hundreds of objects, and they did not stay in the valley. They went out with the drovers and the peddlers and the travelling men, down the mountain and out into the wide country, into parlours and curiosity cabinets and, in time, into the glass cases of the little county museums that dot that whole region, where a surprising number of them, careful people have noticed, still sit today, labelled with a maker unknown and a provenance that trails off into nothing. The folklorist who first gathered this story tried to track a few of them down in the 1930s, and what she found, and set down in a footnote that most people who read her work skip right over, is worth more than the whole rest of the tale. She used 60 tome. She located 11 of the carved figures in private hands and small collections across 3 states. She examined them, and she reported that the black wood they were cut from matches no species that grows on this continent or, as far as any botanist she consulted could say, on any continent at all, and that the pale material she had taken for bone did not test as the bone of any animal known to the men, she asked. She reported that the figures were all, without exception, carved in the same posture, a posture she found difficult to describe and impossible to photograph in a way that satisfied her, a figure bent slightly forward with its face turned down and its hands laid flat, as though pressing something into the ground or listening to something in it. And she reported, in the last line of the footnote, the detail that made her stop her research and never publish the book she had planned, and give the whole file to a colleague and refuse to speak of it again. She reported that the families who owned the figures, every one of them, in houses hundreds of miles apart, told her the same small domestic complaint without any of them knowing the others existed. They told her that the room the figure stood in was always the warmest room in the house, that in the dead of winter, with the fire banked low, you could stand near the little carved thing and feel a warmth coming off it, faint and steady and deep, and that if you put your hand against it and held very still, some of them said, and only some, you could almost believe you felt it move. That is why the erasure could never truly be finished, and Fenn must have known it, and it may be the real reason he died the way he did, worn to nothing by a labour he understood could not be completed. A name is a door, he had said. But a name is not the only door. The family had spent 50 years seeding the wide world with hundreds of small, warm objects carved in the shape of a thing that presses its hands to the ground and listens, and every one of those objects is a splinter of the older ground carried out past the blank fold in the map and into the ordinary rooms of ordinary people, and every one of them, the folklorist came to believe, is a little open window in a house whose owners have no idea what they are keeping warm. Fen could close the great door on the ridge. He could not go into 10,000 parlours and take back the splinters. And so the story does not end on Harrow Ridge, and it does not end in the courthouse stove, and it does not really end at all, which is exactly the quality that separates a legend, which is finished and safe, from whatever this is, which is not. Think back to the name you typed in the comments at the start of this, the small town closest to where you grew up, the one that barely shows on a map. I want you to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment, because the Netherby story is not really about one burned ridge in one forgotten hollow. It is about a pattern, and the pattern is everywhere, and once you have seen it, you cannot stop seeing it. Almost every one of you knows a piece of ground the local people will not build on, a stretch of woods the hunting dogs refuse, a house at the end of a road that has stood empty longer than anyone can explain, and that no fire and no flood ever touched. Almost every one of you grew up half a mile from a family that the neighbours spoke of in lowered voices, whose land you were told not to cross, whose name your parents knew and would not quite say. You were taught the shape of the fear without ever being told the reason for it, the way that Valley taught its children not to climb past the split oak, and you carried that shape into your own life without ever once asking who put it there, or what it was built around, or what would happen if someone finally went and looked. That is how the older ground keeps itself. Not with monsters. Monsters get hunted. It keeps itself with forgetting, with the redrawn map and the burned deed, and the name on the tip of a tongue that never quite arrives, with a whole population trained across generations to feel the dread and never name the cause, because the naming is the door and the door is the danger. The Netherbys understood this better than anyone. They knew that a valley which never says your name but can never forget it is a valley that feeds you forever. And Josiah Fen, at the terrible end of his terrible victory, understood it too, which is the only thing that makes sense of a grieving father spending his last 11 years making certain that his own daughter's killers would be scrubbed so completely from the world that no future child would ever be able to look them up and mean them, and by meaning them, wake them. And notice how gentle the trap is, how kind it feels from the inside. No one in that valley ever chose to feed a sleeping thing. Every single one of them only chose the smaller, softer thing in front of them. To move the family down to the low fields for the schooling, to keep the children off the high slopes for their own good, to grieve quietly and not make a scene, to let the dead rest and the past be past and the hard night be forgotten so the living could go on. Each choice was reasonable, each choice was loving, and each choice, laid end to end across 2 generations, was another handful of soil packed down over the door, another year of the whole valley doing exactly what the older ground needed it to do, which was to feel the dread and never ever name the cause. That is the shape of it everywhere you find it. It never asks you to do anything monstrous. It only asks you to do the comfortable thing again and again, until the comfortable thing has built the whole world around the buried place, and no one alive remembers there was ever a choice at all. So here is the question the whole story finally leaves you with, and it is not the question you think. The question is not whether the Netherbys were real, or whether something still breathes in the warm ground on top of Harrow Ridge. The question is why so much of the history you were handed comes with the difficult parts already removed, why the maps have blank folds in them, why the old surveys carry words like older ground and then fall silent, why the deep past of the very continent you live on is a story of vanished builders and dressed stone that no one is supposed to ask about, ruins that do not fit the tidy account of who came first and what they could do, whole ages that seem to have been drawn through with a single black line by a careful hand a very long time ago. The men who study this pattern are laughed at and told they see faces in the clouds, and told that absence of evidence is not evidence of anything at all. But the men who study this pattern did not leave the hollow off the map. Someone else did that. Someone always does. And the deeper you follow it, the harder it becomes to believe that all the erasing across all the centuries is an accident, and the easier it becomes to believe what the old Reverend wrote in the last line of his letter, that the forgetting is not a failure of history but a defence, arranged again and again by people who went up their own mountains and saw their own sleeping things breathe, and came down knowing that the only weapon that has ever held the line is the one we are all, right now, quietly helping to wield. We forget. And the door stays closed, and the world does not end. And almost no one ever wonders why the ground beneath the oldest places is faintly, steadily, patiently warm. The Netherbys of Sorrel Hollow feared nothing in this world, and the whole valley feared them, and in the end a company of grieving fathers climbed a forbidden ridge on the longest night of the year and burned that fear to the ground, and then spent the rest of their lives making sure you would never hear about it. You just did, which means the door, for the length of this story, has been standing open. So let us close it the right way, together, before we go. If this is the kind of history that the tidy version leaves out, the kind that lives in the blank folds of the map, then subscribe, because next week we are going up another one of those unnamed hollows, to another ring of stone the surveyors pretended not to see, and I do not want you to miss where it leads. Before you go, do one last thing for the people who come after you. Down in the comments, tell me the name of the ground near you that no one will build on, the woods the dogs will not enter, the family the old folks would not name, not to wake anything, to remember that it was real. Because the moment we all agree to forget these places completely is the moment someone, somewhere, is finally free to go up the mountain and put their hand flat against the warm and waiting ground, and remember it back. Keep your lamp lit. Bar your door on the longest night, and whatever you do, do not climb past the oak. I will see you at the next hollow.